taking upon it to introduce everyone and today's session. So, welcome to today's ASEH event, the first of 3 sessions on geography, geographers, and historians, territory and nature in Latin America. The objective of these sessions is to share with the academic public our reflections on the theories, epistemologies, concepts, and methods with which we approach environmental history in Latin America. The 2 ensuing sessions will take place at the same time tomorrow and Wednesday, respectively. Special thanks are due to Marina Miraglia of the Universidad Nacional de General Sarmiento in Argentina for her careful work organizing these sessions. Marina will be presenting later this week. Today's session includes 3 speakers. As the first speaker, I, Samuel Brandt, will explore the concept of the Brazilian scene using the framework of geographer David Lowenthal. Our second speaker, Adi Estela Lazos Ruíz, will discuss links and exchanges of materials between Spain and its colonies in the 18th century. And our final speaker, Mikhail Wolff, will speak on the work of climate and weather geographers in Cuba and Mexico. And I will now allow Mikhail to introduce myself.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Welcome, everybody. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. So I will be introducing Sam Brandt, who is a PhD candidate in geography at UCLA. He's a historical and cultural geographer, focusing on Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina in the 20th century and the present. Broadly, he's interested in the relations between urban and rural, domestic and foreign, and wealth and poverty. He's the recipient of 2 Fulbright Awards to Uruguay, and his dissertation is a history and ethnography of Uruguay's movement for the eradication of unhealthy rural housing, a parastatal initiative that has improved the quality of life for poor rural Uruguayans since 1967. He holds a BA in geography from the University of Chicago. I went to graduate school there. And his undergraduate thesis on urban planning in England has been featured by the BBC. So without further ado, Sam. You need to unmute.
Thank you, Mikhail. So we begin with Brazil. Okay, excellent. So this paper applies David Lowenthal's 1968 Geographical Review article, The American Scene, and John dos Passos' 1963 Travelogue, Brazil on the Move, to develop a notion of the Brazilian scene. I argue for the importance of scene as a concept in geographic inquiry and the relevance of Brazil to concerns across the discipline. Scene matters to geographers, and by extension environmental historians, because it provides immense pedagogical value in explaining the character and most important features of a place. As a demographic and socioeconomic microcosm of the world, Brazil is fertile ground for constructing a theory of scene. 3 interrelated concepts are integral to the Brazilian scene: ufanismo, or pride in abundance of land and natural resources, a belief in the promise of the future, and movement inward from the Atlantic towards frontiers. A close reading of Brazil on the Move advances the concept of scene beyond the long succession of idealized images and visual stereotypes posed by Lowenthal, and towards including visions that better account for issues of contemporary and present interest. So in the limited time we have, I will eschew discussing my closer readings of Lowenthal and dos Passos, and will instead focus on some of the bigger ideas in the paper. And so there are 5 of them listed on here. Scene is an important idea for geographers, how we make sense of places. Brazil has global importance, not simply because it's big, but because it's a microcosm of the world, as we'll discuss. There are parallels in what Lowenthal writes on America in 1968 with what is going on in Brazil. And 3 ideas help us understand Brazil quite well, this idea of scene there, these ufanismo, futurism, and movement. And then lastly, dos Passos, his reading of Brazil at a similar time as Lowenthal, helps us improve upon this concept of scene. The world is made up of places. It's the geographer's challenge to make sense of these places. One step towards making this sense is through setting the scene of a given place. In a 1968 article in the Geographical Review titled The American Scene, David Lowenthal introduced the idea of scene, applying it to the United States of America. He says, "The American scene, as much as any other, mirrors a long succession of idealized images and visual stereotypes." So what Lowenthal is talking about here is looking around you, seeing geography as an ocular subject. Scenes are not mere descriptions that excuse geographers from empirical work and analysis, but rather set a foundation for such empirical analyses to be possible, intelligible, grounded, and lively. Scene matters to geographers because it contextualizes how we interpret the places we study. By reaching across disparate human and physical elements spanning the past and present, scene has immense pedagogical value as a tool to explain the character and the most important features of a given place. Perhaps the most exciting feature of scene is that it can be applied almost anywhere and at a wide variety of scales. While the national scene is the scale relevant to the texts discussed in this paper, nation is far from the only possible unit of scene analysis. For example, New York has a different scene than Los Angeles, Tuscany than Sicily. Simply by employing scene as a mode of analysis, a burgeoning literature is possible across the entire world. This literature is one in which competing visions are possible and encouraged. Different individuals and groups can articulate the same place in radically different ways, and scenes, while they draw heavily on history and foundational myths, are neither static nor monolithic. Despite Lowenthal's clarity in his ability to identify with popular conceptions of place, his paper on the American scene has not, in my view, been sufficiently revisited by geographers. This has been the case both with respect to applying the idea of scene as a conceptual methodological innovation and to using the American scene to compare and contrast with the scene of other countries. A reverse citation search for the American scene on Google Scholar reveals that Lowenthal's paper has been cited by geographers in a dozen non-Anglo-American countries. However, the vast majority of results are either surveys of humanistic geography or examinations of hyper-localized problems. The lack of engagement with Lowenthal's paper is perhaps due in part to his failure to adequately differentiate scene from cultural landscape. Lowenthal outlines broad historical geographical evolution, albeit one replete with contemporary photographs from his personal collection, implied by the latter term of cultural landscape rather than a sense of present timeliness implied by the former scene. In taking the case of Brazil, I apply Lowenthal's ideas to understand the scene of a different nation. I do so guided by a close reading of John dos Passos' 1963 travelogue, Brazil on the Move. On its own terms, Brazil on the Move is a helpful text to anyone wishing to make a cross-sectional reconstruction of Brazil during the early 1960s on the eve of a military coup. Dos Passos is a cogent and commanding commentator of considerable consequence. He was no casual visitor to South America's largest country, having made consistent trips for 15 years before writing Brazil on the Move. His perspective draws both on frequent meetings with power brokers and on conversations with common laborers. Read in tandem with Lowenthal, Brazil on the Move is especially valuable in building a conception of the Brazilian scene that is not limited to the archaic, mythical, and impressionistic. Unlike Lowenthal, Dos Passos is attuned to both the long-term patterns that interest scholars of cultural landscape and to the present ongoings implied by the term scene. Writing shortly after the Cuban Revolution, Dos Passos is routinely on the lookout for signs as to whether such an event could occur in Brazil. Contemporary themes of inequality and underdevelopment, such as food insecurity, the political agency of peasants, and the rapid growth of urban peripheries are present throughout the book. My exercise here is more didactic than definitive, offering an initial attempt at defining the Brazilian scene that invites rather than precludes additional readings. It aims to pick geographers' interest in reviving, improving upon, and applying the concept of scene, in the process offering geographers and historians a useful addition to our toolkit. Furthermore, the choice of Brazil is not happenstance. As documented in the graph on the left, development economist Branko Milanovic has termed Brazil a microcosm of the world. In a global context, Brazil's socioeconomic, ethnic, and interregional heterogeneity are about as close to superlative as a country can get. While it may not be a geopolitical power in the same league as other massive countries like the US or China, Brazil is a preeminent food exporter to all world regions, as comprehensively documented in Herb Klein and Francisco Vidal's book On the Right. As such, present discourse about its landscapes, land use, are relevant globally. As much as anywhere in the world, South America's largest and most populous country offers a living laboratory into the full spectrum of the human condition. Finally, due to Brazil's extraordinary scale and regional diversity, the exercise of setting a national scene in Brazil is valuable for the opportunities it allows us to employ two of geography's core concepts, region and areal variation. As fertile ground for inquiries into the sameness and difference of place, Brazil presents immense promise for geographical inquiry by area specialists and generalists alike. So Lowenthal's efforts are helpful in trying to outline the Brazilian scene, not simply for their conceptual and methodological reasons, but also because much of what he concludes about America rings true about Brazil. And there are four main tropes here, those of bigness, of physical geographic impediments, of ephemerality, things moving on quickly, and then the idea of places being unfinished, Brasilia being a prime example. But in the US, it's this idea of, it's always about what's going to happen, not necessarily what has happened. The casual foreign observer of Brazil is likely to conjure up images of beaches, favelas, and the Amazon, collectively seeing Brazil as a tropical other that is both paradise and hell. This is often the case from a North Atlantic perspective, but also from neighboring Argentina and Uruguay, with their more temperate climes, fewer natural resources, more European populations, and longer histories of broad social support. While the contrast between Edenic climes and in-your-face poverty, as well as pristine forests and its rampant destruction, are hallmarks of the Brazilian scene, they in and of themselves offer neither a complete picture nor a historical one. In other words, how, when, why, and where did it get to be this way? My paper doesn't seek to answer these questions about perception, as enticing as they may be, but it does proffer a set of tropes that, like Lowenthal's exercise in the US over a half-century ago, can contextualize geographic research and teaching about Brazil to both understand and challenge these stereotypes. Rather than focusing on types of places like the favela, the beach, the gold mine, or the rubber tappers reserve, the main category of thought here is the ideas and intellectual tensions that both make these actual places possible and situate them in people's conception of the nation. These ideas help geographers and historians expand their knowledge of Brazil and see a nation, both spatially and conceptually, between the smoothness of the beaches and the coarseness of the rainforest, and between the ecstasy of Carnaval and the poverty of the favela. So three interrelated concepts in Brazilian history, geography, and society do an excellent job of helping to set the scene upon which events happen and lives are lived in Brazil. First is ufanismo, a pride in Brazil's vastness and natural resources that has persisted from the awe of early European travel chronicles to present debates about whether the nation's abundance is best preserved or exploited. The term comes from the 1900 book Por que me ufano do meu país, Why I Sing the Praises of My Country, written by the poet, essayist, and ardent monarchist Afonso Celso. Second is the idea that Brazil is a land of the future, a place that offers immense utopian potential. This was articulated explicitly by the Austrian author Stefan Zweig in his 1941 travel account, Brazil, a Land of the Future. Zweig wrote the book amidst the horrors of World War II Europe, which he had left in hope that Brazil would provide an optimism to chart the course of the world in peacetime. Third is the titular idea of another book written by an admiring visitor to Brazil, the American John dos Passos, his 1963 travelogue, Brazil on the Move. This idea is that Brazil is a country characterized by high degrees of movement among its population, particularly inward movement from the Atlantic towards frontiers. Dos Passos' travels and writings are designed to mirror the movement from Brazil's coastal cities into its vast interior. He was writing in a moment where the Brazilian drive for movement, belief in the future, and use of virgin lands were all taking shape rather visibly in the inauguration of the new capital, Brasilia, a process which Dos Passos documents closely, both before and after its completion, I might add. Together, these abstract concepts of abundance, future, and movement help set the Brazilian scene. Beyond their conceptual value, they also contribute to concrete material realities. Shown in these slides, 3 recent works from scholars in 3 different disciplines provide welcome insight into how these national ideas have played out on the ground in distinct local settings. Ufanismo, the future, and movement represent 3 of the most important patterns that constitute the Brazilian scene. And cattle ranching in Acre, as we see here with Jeffrey Hilla, modern architecture in Paraná with Renato Leal, and automobility across Brazil, but especially in São Paulo with Joel Wolfe, represent activities indicative of those patterns. So I won't go into detail about where he travels, but I show you this map just to give you a sense of the breadth of where he was going. He was visiting, to use a metaphor of conquest, many theaters of the Brazilian frontier. And wherever he goes, he talks about the ways in which this frontier is rapidly expanding. And you see, he goes to all 5 major regions of Brazil, to the north or Amazon, to the northeast, to the center west, especially in Goiás, to the southeast, these trips from Rio and Espírito Santo into Minas, and then he has a trip to Paraná as well. And I find his anecdotes about the red dust of Maringá to be very interesting. So in my own reading of Dos Passos, I note 5 main features of movement that are happening in Brazilian frontiers. And I'll just say a bit about each of these. So first is that frontiers in Brazil, it's not simply about it's individuals. It's not an abstract concept, but this involves people top down, like Bernardo Sayão, the architect of the Brasilia-Belém highway, but also laborers from the bottom up who are eking out a hardscrabble existence as they move from frontier to frontier, mining or agriculture or whatever it may be. Haste is another important idea. So the role of aviation comes up prominently. It's something that, no pun intended, is taking off at the time Dos Passos is writing. And this is especially important in Goiás and Brasilia because of its importance on a cross-hemispheric axis. A third characteristic is that belief and enthusiasm undergird much of this movement towards frontiers. And I have Sandro Dutra's book here, and we'll learn more about this in the Wednesday session. But one thing he points out that I think is important to add on to what Dos Passos is saying is that religion is a big part of this belief. And in the case of Goiás, the importance of Protestantism in building these colonies and in driving this movement. And it's a spirit that I found in my own visits to Goiás to be very much present today. Fourth is that movement is forward thinking. So this is the case in Brasilia. Dos Passos cites the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin saying upon landing in Brasilia that he hadn't expected to reach Mars so soon. But it's also the case in Belo Horizonte, looking out over the beautiful horizon of the Western frontier. And then lastly is this idea of problem solving. So migration, both from Europe, as Zweig had hoped to escape the horrors of World War II, earlier as well, of course, but migration is an act of problem solving, international migration and internal migration. And you see a map here of 3 different major migrations in Brazil in the 60s and 70s. And I have a photo here of an example that I like, and it's dairy colonies in Paraná of Dutch immigrants. And some of them came earlier in the 20th century, but others came after World War II, and it's been extremely profitable. And these products from Castrolanda in Paraná are a household brand throughout Brazil. So these stories have varying degrees of success. The Dutch example being a prime one, but you also have examples of people like in quilombos. That's a way of movement of a different nature. problem solving. So these are my readings of Dos Passos, some ways of looking at the Brazilian scene, specifically how movement is involved in that. And then to conclude, I'll just mention again, the three things that I'm trying to hit home in this talk. That scene, even if people haven't dealt with it much since Lowenthal was writing, it's an important idea in geography that gets us to our core question of what is going on in a given place at a given time. Second is that Brazil as a microcosm of the world matters globally. What's going on in Brazil doesn't just stay in Brazil, especially if it's soy. And then lastly, for anyone teaching about Brazil or presenting it in whatever kind of way, I think these three concepts of ufanismo, the future, and movement, as they've been articulated both by foreigners and Brazilians, it's not just foreigners coming and writing these things, but you have people like Darcy Ribeiro, Clodomir Viana-Mogi, who are talking about these things in Brazil as well. So these three ideas can organize how we talk about this grand country. So thank you very much, and we will move on to our next speaker, Estela Lazos. Thank you. So to introduce Adi, bringing a variety of disciplinary backgrounds and a love of outdoor fieldwork to environmental history, Adi Estela Lazos Ruíz studies socio-ecological interactions, especially in forest zones. She has a bachelor's in agricultural engineering from the Querétaro campus of the Technological Institute of Monterrey, an international master's in rural development from the Erasmus Mundus program, and a doctorate in biodiversity from the University of Alicante. She did a postdoc in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, where she began to work with environmental history. She has since returned to Mexico, where she is now a postdoc at the Peninsular Center for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, widely known as UNAM. So here we go, Adi.
Thank you, Sam. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having us here. And well, I will share my presentation. Okay, let me see. Okay. Can you guys see the presentation now? Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, well, today I want to make an exercise reinterpreting some historical sources that I used in a paper that is already published. It was published at the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Environmental History, and I conducted research on the transport of plants and animals between Spain and its colonies during the last quarter of the 18th century. At the time, I was looking for some information about trees in the New Spain, current-day Mexico, at the General Archive of the Indies in Sevilla, in Spain. This is the beautiful old building of the archive. Here I focused on the documents which were not digitalized. As you may know, the descriptions of the documents provide their general contents. So trees were not usually the main topic at the description, and therefore I looked for some other related topics such as wood, charcoal, and so on. And then I found some files in the category of general indifferent. That means everything that didn't fit anywhere else. And these files were called remissions of woods, plants, and seeds. Voila, that was gold for me. As I said, these documents were not digitalized, were like that. And at least until April 2019, the General Archive of the Indies did not allow to take pictures, and asking for photocopies is a procedure that takes several months. Therefore, what people do is to transcribe or take notes in situ. By the way, people working in the archive is very nice and helpful. So I found these files and got interested not only in the trees of the region of study, but in the epic character of the journeys in the transport of plants and animals. It was so interesting, and I was having so much fun reading them. I wondered when someone would find these files again in the ocean of documents at this enormous archive. Later, I discovered a handful of research papers that also used these files. I decided to do something with that material, and I took notes and transcribed some fragments of 74 letters and analyzed them in the paper I already mentioned. The letters were written or made references to all these places that are pinpointed in the map. I organized the paper describing the daily dramas experienced during the journey. Let us remember the context of the time in the last quarter of the 18th century. Like this map is showing the parts in red were the colonies of Spain, such as Latin America and the Philippines in Asia. The Enlightenment ideas prevailed in Europe. There was interest on natural history collections and botanical gardens in Europe, and the colonies were a vast source of new specimens. The studies of Linnaeus were gaining a depth in Europe, and they started adopting his taxonomic proposals and giving names of species in Latin. So reviewing these files, I found a letter called a circular letter, which was an order sent by the King of Spain, Charles III, at that time, to all the colonies, asking for a sample of every plant, every animal, and every mineral from all the places in the realm. This letter had the instructions to provide information on the name, uses, way of cultivation, a description of each specimen, and how to send it to Spain, like in this picture. The letter itself arrived in the colonies at different times. It was different to send the letter to Buenos Aires than to the Philippines or to the middle of the Andes. It depended on the frequency and availability of the naval post. After receiving the order, the people in charge had to make the collection and gather the information requested. So there were shipments from the Americas and Asia of live plants and animals, seeds, remedies of plants, woods of enormous trees, fish, stuffed animals, rocks. Some material got lost in the monsoon or in storms. Some other was robbed by pirates. And well, the live plants and animals were really difficult to transport, as the journey took months, and therefore they needed to guarantee the supply of food and fresh water for these living organisms, these live plants and animals. At some point, there were so many samples in Spain. In the ports of Cádiz and Sevilla. As we can see, Cádiz is in the south and Sevilla is also in the south. And you can see that Sevilla is not in the coast, but there still was a port because the ships arrived navigating from the sea through the Guadalquivir River. So from these places, from the south, the materials still had to be transported to Madrid, where there were other sort of problems like how to transport or to classify the samples. And well, some years later, the court ended up asking to stop the shipments because it was impossible to keep everything. And well, some of these materials constitute the collections of natural history and botanical gardens that we see even today. The exercise I want to do today is to read again these letters. That I will, this is to remind the letters that they were from all these places. But I want to read them with a different question in mind. I want to bring into light the contributions of local indigenous people in the guidance, the labor, and the construction of knowledge in the formation of these collections. It is possible to see in the letters that the collection of specimens and the information attached to them depended on who was in charge. There were some expeditions specifically for the purposes of botanic collections that had botanists, doctors, naturalists. But in the case of the circular letter, it got to more administrative-oriented people. So the quality of the shipment depended on the criteria of these non-specialist people in charge. They needed at least scribes and good informants that most probably were local people, but they were not given the credits. So to find the participation of these local people in the letters, we need to analyze in depth and to ask who possibly know this information. Some hints about the contributions of these people are hidden in the names of the species. In some cases, there was no translation to Spanish, and not enough time has passed so that a word in Spanish was invented to name that species. I want to open a parenthesis here. About this point, the geographer Alfred Siemens from the UBC, he has a chapter in the book Studies of History and Environment in America, the first volume, and he writes about the difficulty of matching local names in historical documents with the scientific names of the species. This is especially challenging if we do not have a sample or a more detailed description of the context. Let us remember that naturalists were recently paying attention to small features of the species for their identification. Taxonomy was, as we know it, was not that old at that time. Some animals, for example, got names in Spanish that resembled some other species that Europeans knew. For example, in the letters, there is a reference to a tiger, which of course was a feline, but we wouldn't know which species was that cat. So, close parenthesis. Another way to reveal local knowledge was the agricultural technology for local conditions. For example, there is a letter making reference to Chinese rice seeds that could be cultivated without additional irrigation. This is an example not from the Spanish colonies, but that contains knowledge of local people, whose experiences and knowledge on rice improvement helped the cultivations in Spain and probably also in other places. The local knowledge became global. Another interesting letter from the Philippines talks about a shipment sending different soil samples for different plants, showing that careful observations and empirical knowledge were involved to reach that kind of advice. There are also mixtures of knowledge of local with European. By the 18th century, there was already a great mixture. This can be seen, for example, in the creation of handicrafts with local materials like fans from different tropical woods, or even some woods were identified as good for making violins. There is an interesting reference to a relationship between local peoples and bats. The letter talks about some almond-like fruits, again a reference to what Europeans already knew, almonds. The trees were so tall that the fruits were very difficult to harvest. Bats also ate these fruits and they used to take them to their caves where they drink their juice. And then the locals collected these almonds in the caves. They were called the Indians of Moyobamba, one of the scarce references to local people in the letters. Another example is a letter from Quito describing someone that lived for 5 years with the indigenous people, learned their language and made friends with them. He proposed that these locals could help cultivating cinnamon. The only direct reference to a person in particular within the 74 letters is from Martín de Cecé, head of the botanical garden. He describes an Indian that was very talented for stuffing animals. He compared the Indian with Joseph Longinos, one of the most recognized taxidermists in Spain. He describes how this Indian learned how to dry and stuff birds, taking care of all the details like the number and the order of the feathers. He recommended that this Indian should be included in the specialist team, but I don't know what happened to him. Anyway, there was no reference to the name of this man. Also, there was a vision between fear and admiration of the Indian plant medicines. On one hand, the use of these remedies was punished by the Inquisition a few decades before the letters were written. And on the other hand, some plant roots were sent to the hospitals of Madrid to treat syphilis. As in any historical research, there is no sense on judging the past with the values of the present. Clearly, the names of individuals and the recognitions of local contributions happened in a colonial context. However, as Enrique Leff says, environmental history is the history of hidden histories. So we could see the participations of those anonymous local indigenous people leaving hints in these letters, and at the end of the day, their knowledge remained imprinted in the landscape and the culture. The last reflection I want to draw here is that this might seem like a situation from the past, though it still happens a lot while doing research and benefiting from local knowledge that is often poorly recognized. And to conclude, I want to give a word about this painting from Federico Cantú, which shows Friar Bernardino de Sahagún and local informants. This friar wrote several books in the early colonial years in the New Spain, and he learned the native language, Nahuatl, and worked with many local informants. These books are very important historical sources. This was in the 16th century, but the painting illustrates the main point of this presentation, to bring light to those behind the scenes, making visible those who remained invisible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adi. I look forward to the Q&A. So our final speaker today is Mikhail Wolff. Mikael is an environmental historian of water and climate issues in modern Latin America. He earned his BA from Columbia University and his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. He is currently assistant professor of history at Stanford University and the author of Watering the Revolution, an environmental and technological history of agrarian reform in Mexico, published by Duke University Press in 2017. This book won the Eleanor K. Melville Book Prize for Latin American Environmental History and was shortlisted for the Maria Elena Martinez Prize on the History of Mexico in 2018. He has also published numerous academic articles and book chapters on water management, agrarian reform, and climate in Mexico and Cuba, including in the Hispanic American Historical Review and Environmental History, as well as op-eds in Proceso and the Washington Post. His second book project is entitled Rebellious Climates: How Extreme Weather Shaped the Mexican and Cuban Revolutions. On to you.
Thank you very much, Sam, for the introduction. And thank you to you and Adi as my fellow panelists, and especially to Marina for organizing all of this. A lot of WhatsApps and emails went back and forth to make this possible. So let me share my screen here, and I'm going to have to explain why the title is a little bit different. Let's see, can you all see my screen? Yes? Yeah, okay. All right, so why the change of title? Well, it was the original title, which brought Mexico and Cuba together, was a little bit more than I could chew. I sort of overextended myself, and it probably reflects the ambition of my comparative book project that Sam just mentioned on climate and revolution in Mexico and Cuba. So unfortunately, I won't have time to get into Cuba, but it's just as well because Bernardo Funes, who I think may be on the Zoom call right now, is really the expert on the topic for Cuba, and he'll be presenting tomorrow during these sessions. And he, in fact, is the one who introduced me to the work of revolutionary geographer Antonio Núñez Jiménez in Cuba, about whom I'll very briefly talk at the end of my presentation today, as kind of a comparative angle between Cuba and Mexico. So for this presentation, as I did preliminary research on Mexican geographers, I was happy to find Mexican counterparts to the Cuban ones only many decades before. Mexican geographers played an important, albeit perhaps less prominent, role in the process of the Mexican Revolution compared to Cuban geographers. Given the importance of understanding climate and weather to the country, and therefore to my research, what follows is a preliminary sketch of the institutional and intellectual genealogy of Mexican geography as the interdisciplinary node for so many other fields that we call STEM today: science, technology, engineering, and math. I do want to say that I rely, and I'm heavily indebted a lot to the published works of historical geographers of Mexico, especially the late Bernardo Garcia Martinez, Hector Mendoza Vargas, and Raymond Crabe, among a few others. Although I've been doing primary research in various newspapers, journals, and archives, I didn't have time to organize my findings and include them here in this talk today. So what I'm doing is kind of more of a sketch of the secondary literature as a way to frame what I hope to do with the primary research. Alrighty, so, actually first, is this going to come back? No, that's not what I wanted. I wanted to go back. Okay, yeah. So first of all, about the periodization. For those of you who are not familiar with Mexican history, 1876 marks the beginning of the Porfiriato, or the rule of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, which lasted until about 1911, when he was overthrown by a revolutionary movement. And his rule was marked by a lot of authoritarianism, but also by a stability, a newfound stability that had been lacking since independence for several decades. And also during his rule, there was a big push to modernize the country along European and North American lines by investing heavily in science and technology at the time. In 1917, where I end, is the promulgation of the new revolutionary constitution, which replaced the old liberal constitution of 1857. And the new constitution had provisions for a massive land reform, as well as labor rights and other social democratic rights that many other countries then in Latin America adopted in the following decades. All right, so now I can go to my next slide. Yes. So there's some key dates, I think, for understanding the development of geography in 19th century Mexico, institutionally in particular. The first is the creation of the Mexican Geographical and Statistical Society in 1833, not long after independence in 1821. And this is a pretty remarkable institution because it still exists to this day. I think it's one of the few that have endured over the course of centuries, especially a tumultuous history. And it was, I think, instrumental for the gradual professionalization of geographers and other types of technical and scientific actors. 20 years later, there was the creation of the Secretariat of Development, known as Fomento in Spanish, which is not quite development, but it's more or less how we translate it. It had actually there was colonization tagged to it, and this Fomento was the main term that endured over time, but over its various iterations and configurations, they would add different terms to it, whether it's agriculture or colonization or commerce or what have you. So I'm just going to refer to it as Fomento. That just makes it easier. And then a little over 20 years hence, with the rise of Porfirio Diaz, there was the establishment of the National Astronomical Observatory, the Geographical Exploration Commission, and the National Meteorological Observatory. Now, Diaz wasn't necessarily creating institutions anew, but he was kind of restructuring them. And I think if you read Raymond Crabe's really great book, Cartographic Mexico, he quotes, Diaz and others in sort of lamenting the state of Mexico's geography and map making and cartography and science and technology in general, just saying it's just in shambles, and we really have to restructure it, renew it, get it going again, if we really want to be a modern country. And you also note that all of these institutions are being founded during a time of real tumult in Mexican history. Whether it was the Mexican-American War, in which Mexico lost half of its territory, or the wars between the liberals and conservatives, and then the French intervention in the 1860s. So it's understandable that it was very difficult for the government to establish enduring institutions that could really make a difference in the kind of development they wanted to see. Now, it's also important to note that all of these institutions had directors that were engineers of some kind, and often what was called geographic engineers. And that's something that I found really intriguing. Even though in my work I'm looking more at meteorology and climatology, I kept seeing reference to geography and geographic engineers. And so when I got the invitation to participate in these panels, I said, yeah, sure. I mean, I need to understand and learn more about this. I wish I'd taken a little more time to do so, but let's go to what I found in terms of a definition. So this is from Héctor Mendoza Vargas, who wrote a great article on Los Ingenieros Geógrafos de México in 2001. And the way he defines this, and I'm translating this from the Spanish into English, not the best translation, my apologies, but a distinct juridical, academic, and professional experience whose temporal existence has been identified from the end of the 18th century into the 19th and a good part of the 20th century. The performance of geographic engineers, which was imagined as a specialist for territorial knowledge through instrumentation, application, and precision. And one thing all of the works really emphasize is the invention of the telegraph in the mid-19th century or so, and its installation in Mexico throughout the country, because it was key to map making as well as other territorial knowledge production. And that would include meteorology and climatology as well. So what did these geographic engineers study? What was their education about? And I found this quite interesting too. Their curriculum varied over time. And institutionally, it was kind of a hybrid formation coming out of both universities and engineering school specialties. And in the first decades after the foundation of the Mexican Geographic and Statistical Society, it was initially very math intensive. Let's see, okay. Meaning algebra, calculus, geometry, and very importantly, incorporating astronomy as well. Now, by the time of the Porfiriato in 1883, after it was consolidated its power and was showing that it was making Mexico stable, there was a 3-year curriculum that included topography and hydromenture, which means gauging streams, essentially figuring out how much water goes through steam flows. I wonder what's going on here. My slides are going crazy. All right, let me get this back here. All right, can we stay? Thank you. All right, so and then of course there was also astronomy and meteorology in the 3rd year, and then by the 1890s, excuse me, there were additions to that included land and water legislation, because those had been changing dramatically during the Porfiriato. Any of you who've studied the origins of the Mexican Revolution One is demise of communal landholding, the surveying of land and privatizing it, and essentially conceding it to private companies or the state or what have you. And then electricity, which was coming into being, and then hydraulics as well, in terms of building larger hydraulic structures like dams and so forth. Now, geographic engineers had a lot in common with topographic engineers, but they differed in key respects. One was that they worked only for the government, and they didn't limit themselves to terrestrial land surveys, but they and rather incorporated the Earth's spherical properties via astronomy. So again, the astronomical component was very important in geographic engineering at this time in Mexico. Now, this is where my research is going to head a lot more in this direction, because I wanted to see the connection between professionally trained engineers, whether they specialized in geography or some other field, say climatology or meteorology, and the actual process of revolution in Mexico, which I'd like to compare to Cuba's case as well. And I did find that an actor who made that connection. I knew of him from a long time ago. He appeared in my first book about hydraulic engineering, and he also was governor of Durango. So that was a region that I was looking at, the Laguna region, which is partially in Durango. But I didn't really look into his formation, his education. And so I found it quite interesting that he was trained as a topographic engineer. So he had a lot in common with geographic engineers. He may have not studied astronomy as such, but he played a leading role in the radical agrarian reform program of the Mexican Revolution, first as governor of Durango, and then as Venustiano Carranza's secretary of Fomento. The name changed again during the revolution. Don't ask me what it was. I can't remember. Fomento y Agricultura or something like that. But he was one of the first governors to decree a land reform in Durango, in his state, in 1913. And that's kind of served as the basis for the federal agrarian law of 1915 under Carranza. And then he also was instrumental in the drafting of the Article 27 of 1917 Constitution, which made it a revolutionary constitution and differentiated it from the 1857 liberal constitution. So you can see a portrait of him, and then he's seated with the commission who studied the Article 27, who came up with what should be in Article 27. You can see that on the bottom left. So during his tenure as in the Secretary of Fomento, of Development, Agriculture, and so forth, he was instrumental as well in restructuring geographic engineering and related fields, especially the creation of a general department, Dirección General, of Geographic and Climatological Studies, which was directed by a geographic engineer, geographic and astronomic engineer, Pedro C. Sanchez. So one who actually came out of that curriculum that I was talking about before. And then Rué as well was a leading voice in the post-revolutionary Geographic and Statistical Society that I mentioned was founded in 1833. But then it had kind of a revolutionary imprimatur. Its social purpose was very different than it was under the Porfiriato. Namely, it was to distribute land, right, to the rural poor majority, at least on paper. Right? We know it took time, and it really wouldn't come to fruition until the 1930s under Lázaro Cárdenas. And one thing that's very interesting too is that the new department subsections were Geographic Commission, Astronomical Observatory, and Meteorological and Seismological Observatory. Essentially the three same ones that Diaz restructured in 1876. So kind of coming full circle from that time. Of course, again, very different social and political context of these institutions. All right, so lastly, in conclusion, and these are very preliminary conclusions, I'm not making any grand claims. This is mostly from the secondary research that I did, But I do want to make a parallel with Cuba's case. So here I'm trying to give you what maybe you paid for, right, in the original title. Well, first, geography was central to Mexican territorial control and nation building, being science and technology. And I was really, truly impressed by the multidisciplinarity of it, whether it was engineering, cartography, hydrography, astronomy, meteorology, climatology. I mean, and those are just some of the fields that geographers are instrumental in either founding or helping to develop or producing an institutional home for in late 19th century Mexico. And geography changed over time in response to evolving state initiatives and elites' perceived national priorities, as we saw. Diaz had one vision, the revolutionaries had another vision, but even over that stretch of time, it would change, as we saw with the curricular changes. And of course, the most dramatic change was during the revolution, when geography went from serving private landholding to redistributing land to the rural majority. And there was a high degree of institutional continuity from the beginnings of the Porfiriato, which I also just mentioned. So I couldn't help but think of that this Pastor Ruíz character is kind of similar to Antonio Núñez Jiménez of Cuba, who Reinaldo Funes has done a lot of work on. Antonio Núñez Jiménez was a revolutionary geographer, although he came out of a very different school of geography. And this happened in Mexico as well. Geography became unmoored from its real technical engineering aspect, and it ended up being housed in a different area of like for the UNAM, and this being part of the philosophy and arts department or its own institute. So Antonio Núñez Jiménez did not train as an engineer as such. So there's obviously that difference, but there's still a continuity in terms of geographical knowledge production. And like Pastor Ruíz, he also was instrumental to Cuba's land reform, agrarian reform. He helped found and lead the National Institute for Agrarian Reform, and he also played a leading role in one of Cuba's most important scientific bodies, the National Center for Scientific Research in the 1960s. So not unlike Pastor Ruíz's role in the Geographic and Statistical Society. So that's it for now. That's kind of my agenda for future research, to see these kinds of parallels and see how these kind of engineers, whether they're geographic or otherwise, how instrumental they were in the process of revolution in both of these countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikael. And I see a lot of different strands in there that will be of interest to environmental historians, geographers, and more. I think it's time that we can open this up for Q&A, open the floor for the rest. I guess we have a half hour or so to do that. So I will, feel free to ask questions in the chat or raise your hand and we will call on you. Thank you.
So I have a question, sorry.
Please go ahead.
For Adi Lazos, it was such a fascinating presentation. I'm working also in exchanging natural knowledge between the Andes and the Spain in the 16th century. But so I was perhaps thinking a bit about my own work. I was wondering a bit if you could share a bit more about how was the process of gathering indigenous knowledge. Was there, for instance, colonial inspectors involved? Did they travel to indigenous communities, or did they just observe indigenous practices and then wrote them on paper? I'm not sure if you had the chance to explore a bit more from that perspective. Thank you.
Shall I respond now? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alfredo, for your question. And well, the sources I studied were letters which already sent like the results or the problems that people were facing during these collections. So the indigenous knowledge was not described as such, was only like they were showing the results. For example, there are some lists of trees with the names and which uses of the leaves or like that, but they didn't mention the how they gathered this information, if they asked someone. Only these particular examples that I presented, right? At least in the letters that I studied. So it's very different. The letters are well written by so many people in very different contexts and places that there's no systematic way of presenting the results that they got. But that was the point of this exercise, to try to read again these sources, bringing into light the indigenous people, because they are not explicitly recognized. I don't know if that helps in answering your question, but anyway, I can send you some of the, for example, some of the letters that were from close to the place you are studying.
Thank you.
So if you could please leave your email or send me an email, I will share with you that material. Thank you.
Y Reinaldo de los Reyes, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I have a question for Mikael. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the relationship between statistics and geography since the 19th century? And related to this, another question is, do you think that after the revolution, maybe the geographers turn more to the academic field than to governmental offices? And I'm asking this because if you think in the National Institute of Geography and Statistics, the INEGI, it was ruled more by statisticians, estadísticos, I don't know the word, than by geographers. You think, for example, in Gilberto Loyo or Emilio Lanis, who were both students of Conrado Gini in Italy, they turned the institution more to the statistics than to the geography. And what happened to the geographers at that time? I mean, in the 1920s and 30s.
Yeah, that's a great question, Renato. And you know, I have to confess to the limits of my knowledge right now because I'm still doing more research about it. I think statistical gathering was still very much in formation in the 19th century. I mean, I think a lot of 19th century historians of Mexico lament very often how it's very difficult to come by, you know, good statistics. I don't know a whole lot, but I would think that, you know, statistical gathering and methods were essential to the production of geographic knowledge and various types of ecological natural processes and understanding Mexican territory. I see it in meteorology and climatology. You know, you can see the statistics getting better over time, and they had, you know, connections with the Sociedad de Geografía y Estadística. I couldn't really go more beyond that at this point. But you're absolutely right that after the revolution, there is kind of a bifurcation, and geography kind of loses that whole engineering side that it had before as there's greater specialization. And certainly the rise of the renewal in some ways of the UNAM, Justo Sierra, you know, who wanted UNAM to be a great national university. And that happens, you know, yeah, like you say, in the 20s and 30s, and then they really departmentalize a lot more. And and geography goes in a different directions, becomes more of a social science than it was, linked to engineering as such. And INEGI, to be honest, I don't even remember exactly when it's founded. I know it's separate from the Sociedad de Geografía y Estadística. And of course, INEGI is much more of a statistical agency. But I mean, if you look at, the way they use GIS, I don't think you could separate the geography from the statistics, particularly in the last, 20, 30 years. But if you're referring to the years before that, you probably could tell me just as much. Because I haven't done the research yet. But thanks for your question, Leonardo.
Adi, and then Reinaldo Funes.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so I wanted to make some, a question and a comment for Sam. I really liked your work, and I was thinking that sometimes Rio de Janeiro is like the face of Brazil, and very linked to the stereotype of the whole country. So it was very interesting to see the map that you showed, that with the visits of those Passos, which has like a which brings these multiple phases of Brazil. So that was only my comment. And I have a question to Mikael. Thank you so much. I learned so much about Mexico, Mikael. You know a lot. And well, my question is that, well, as we know, in Mexico, Porfirio Diaz is recognized as a dictator, right? So he was re-elected many times, and he was in the presidency for so many years. And do you think that this institutional continuity was possible because of this dictatorship and the ideas of Porfirio Diaz, or do you think that if some other people were ruling the country, the same, well, obviously not the same results would result, but how do you think that this dictatorship from Porfirio Diaz sorry, influenced this institutional continuity? Sorry, I'm talking with people in Spanish, Portuguese, and English at the same time in the chat. Well, that was a question.
Who goes first? Sam, I think you were, or she asked a question first.
I think her note for me was more of a comment than anything. But yeah, that's part of what I'm trying to do in this piece is move beyond a singular conception of Brazil that's encapsulated in Rio and these binaries of favela and beach. Not that those binaries don't have valence in themselves.
Well, thank you, Adi. I'm glad you learned some. I learned a lot too, and I did it in a very short amount of time. But yeah, that's a great counterfactual question, right? You know, if it hadn't been a dictatorship, what would have happened? But I think the fact that it was a dictatorship definitely influenced the way that the institutions were run and who was appointed, and what they could say, and their freedom of action and thought and so forth. But I think if there had been a stable, let's say, more democratic government with alternates at every election, I would think that the institutions would still continue as they do today. I mean, I don't see, even if there's a, alternates between Morena and PAN or something, they're not going to do away with INEGI or something, right? I mean, they might change the personnel and maybe some of its mission changes or something. But I think the most important thing was stability, right? That there was constant funding for it, that there wasn't chaos, right? Different military factions and that sort of thing. So, you know, so the way I'd answer that is like, yes, the fact that it was a dictatorship certainly affects the way that the institutions are run, but I don't think it would have changed their continuity necessarily. So I hope that's, you know, that's a satisfactory answer. I think Reinaldo has had his hand up before. Reinaldo, we can't hear you.
Now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Good presentations, and I found a lot of connection. Excellent, of course. I found now some connections that I don't know yet by the Mikhail Wolff work between these geographers in Mexico and the geographers in Cuba. And I think it's interesting to find this kind of connection, no, beyond the other influence that we already know from the French geographers, US geographers, or European geographers in general. And I think it's a very interesting moment. And I want to ask both, because I think Sam also, he not talked about the Brazilian geographers, but I think this kind of reflection were very present in Brazil, maybe Josué de Castro, and the kind of creation of social consciousness in these geographers, maybe because they were more connected with the territory, with the change that are happening beyond the cities, as the historian maybe are more at the archive. And this is why I think that geographers are a very good source for the environmental history, no? And I think this is one of the goals of these panels these days, no? And I think it's really interesting, the involvement of some geographers in the Mexican Revolution, as happened after in the Cuban Revolution. In Brazil case, it's maybe a little different, because as we know, Brazil never had a real revolution. Maybe it's a more, in some way, a more conservative way to change. But also that kind of reflection about geography was present in Brazil in the mid-50s, for example, no? And I would like to know, for example, in Mikael's work, if you found what kind of influence you found from the discussion about human geography, for example. We know in that time, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, we can see a lot of determinists, geographical determinists, how these people react against the geographical determinists in some way from the Latin American perspective. What kind of connection between Latin American geographers you already found, or you think it's possible to find in that period, during the 20th century, the first half or the second half? The discussion about development, I think, is very interesting also, because maybe Brazil represents another different way from this revolutionary way to achieve some transformation as Mexico and Cuba, and what kind of geographical ideas you found in this moment, no? In the case of Mexico, or the case of Brazil, or the case of Cuba. But I think we can find a really interesting connection, as you are doing, no? With these people who were very influential in some moment of their careers because their involvement on politics, no? And I think this is something very interesting, no? And I remember some of the document that Adi was presenting today. I don't remember if they, for example, if they sent a crocodile from the Caribbean or from Cuba to Spain. I don't remember very well, but I know in 19th century, they sent some to Europe, to France, to Spain, because it was very hard to transport all these animals and plants to Europe in that moment, no? And I think it's a really fascinating topic also. I think my question is very confused. It's a little confused, but I would like to know more about that transition between a notion about geography as something more physics to the geography or something more connected with the human change and human transformation.
Yeah, thank you, Fernando. I would love to find a direct connection between Mexican geographers and Cuban ones. I haven't done that research yet. I mean, part of the challenge is the separation in time, right? The two revolutions happened 40, 50 years apart. So, and then during that time, that's exactly when geography, I think, really changes as a discipline, and it gets unmoored from that more sort of technical background, at least in Mexico's case. And you can tell us about Cuba better, and maybe Brazil as well, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's a circulation of knowledge, because in the journals, they're always referencing other parts of the world. Now, of course, they tend to reference what's happening in Europe and the United States more than other countries, but sometimes they do have other Latin American contributions, and or they travel, you know, to other Latin American countries, and you know, they realize our country is more like, you know, our fellow Latin American countries than it is like the United States and Europe, even though the more advanced, you know, technology is coming from Europe and the United States. So yeah, I mean, this is still wide open for me. I'm still working on it, so we'll be in touch, definitely, about it.
Sandro?
Thank you, Sam. I'd like to compliment everyone. It was a wonderful panel. All the three presentations was remarkable. During Adi presentations, I have a chance to read your article, Adi, earlier, and we are honored to have it with us in EHWEEK. So seeing your presentation, I remember how important role EHWEEK plays in share and spread Latin America studies and researches. So, Mikael, your topic is a fascinating one, and during your presentation, I remember I have chance also to read the last book of my friend, my brother Reinaldo, my hermano Reinaldo, The Cuban Conquering of the Moon. And I noticed that how geographers played a more important role than the politicians. It's not the main argument of Reinaldo's, but it's interesting to notice the important role of geographers, and you are bringing another perspective of it. It is actually so fascinating. And Sam as well, your presentation. And for Sam, I have I would like to compliment for your creative perspective of trying to construct your argument, connecting Lowenthal and Dos Passos. And I have for you two questions. First one, I was impacted by that photograph of Bernard Sayão. Sayão, it was for me important. It was for me a interesting character in my own research, because he was a Carioca agronomist. In the 1940s, he came to Goiás to coordinate, to direct the National Agriculture Colony during the march to the West. And then during the Kubitschek government, he was responsible for the construction of that road connecting Brasilia and to Belém, the Belém-Brasilia Railway, highway. So at the end of the construction, he died because a tree fell down over him, which was something that during my archival research, I was impacted how politicians and how the media at the time treated this specific event, putting Sayão as a hero and the nature as the national enemy against the development of the Brazilian Republic. So it is something that, for me, is a fascinating topic. And my question is, because it was clear for me, more than anything, that the euphemism that it appears in Dos Passos, it's much more related to the frontier experiences in Brazil than the coastal, as Adi says, the how can I say, the image, the common image of Rio de Janeiro as a category to represent Brazil, but this Passos, he had another perspective of this kind of euphemism. So would you explore, please, this perspective? How does those Passos create or build his narratives relating euphemism and the frontier, the Brazilian frontier? Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sandro. Just a moment. Okay, so if we remembered the map that I showed of Dos Passos going in, it's 7 different trips that he takes to different parts of Brazil, and each one he starts out from the coast. So I think it's important to say that Dos Passos, he's not just looking at frontiers, but he's looking at how these frontiers emerge from the Atlantic. So whether these are deeper ones like the Center West, where he's exploring via aviation, or ones closer to the coast, just going up the Rio Doce from Vitória into the eastern part of Minas Gerais, which, as the crow flies, is not very far from the coast. These same processes are going on. I think that Warren Dean's book with Broad Axe and Firebrand is, I mentioned it in the article, and there are parallels in there with what Lowenthal says as well about just how important forest clearing is in all of this movement in both of these countries. But yeah, I mean, this idea of the frontier is not something that's, I think this is important to point out to people who aren't as familiar with Brazil and who may only be familiar with Rio and the Amazon, but that this idea of ufanismo, it starts on the coast. It starts with the first European looking at a tree of Brazil nuts and marveling at this natural resource and abundance of land. I mean, this is the case for these early generations of European explorers, conquerors, whatever you want to call them, and even if they're only going no more than 50 miles inland from the coast. So I think this, and the other thing, maybe less about ufanismo, but the national futurism, this spirit is alive in the 60s, and it's captured not just Dos Passos, but in popular media in the US, and things like Life magazine, and that Brasilia as the airplane, that's also ties into the space race as well. So these are some other aspects that Dos Passos points to, and I think reading people like Dean we can think about. But yeah, the frontiers are not just something remote, it's something that begins from the Atlantic. And I'll point out here that in the paper I cite Jacob Blank's forthcoming book on Brazilian history from the inside. That's something, it's not out yet, but I'm really looking forward to seeing that and hearing what he has to say about these issues as well. So I think this is enough for me for now. We have time for one more quick question and quick answer if we'd like to do that.
Well, if I could just say something, I was about to type this to Ronaldo, but now that I have a minute or so, another really interesting parallel between Pastor Rue and Antonio Nunes Jimenez is that Rue also fought in the revolution. He initially fought with the División del Norte of Villa. So it makes me think that, Nunes Jimenez, he fought with Che, right? Che Guevara too. So he also was a soldier in the revolution, as well as, being this topographic engineer who then got involved in the land reform and so on and so forth. So I was just thinking even more parallels.
Yes. Okay, so, tomorrow I will present about the professor of Nunes Jimenez. Maybe he's one of the connections that you can explore a little more in Mexico, for example. Okay, but very interesting connection we can find. And Sam, let me say something. Any connection about this concept of ufanismo with the idea about tropicalidad by Freire and others?
I will have to think about that. My reading of Freire is that he has very great detailed things to say about the Northeast, but his knowledge of the rest of Brazil is quite limited. Like, I don't know if he ever even set foot in the South. And so that's, yeah, I mean, lusotropicalism, tropicalidade, these are also things that should be taught to students of Brazil in the same way. So it's not that ufanismo is any more or less important to the Brazilian scene. But yeah, you bring up a good point there. And with any of these concepts, what are the limits of them geographically, temporally, and demographically as well? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Adi.
Adi had her hand up before Sandra, but we do have to close out. Is it? Yeah.
Okay, just a quick question comment to Mikael again. Did I get it right that some people were working before and after the revolution? If that is so, that is very interesting, because in the end, the geographic engineers were in a very interesting position for decision making about the territory. So before and after, right? And as you just said, they were also biased by their ideological own ideas, ideological contents, right? Well, that was the comment.
Yeah, I mean, I know we don't have much time, but yeah, there is a lot of continuity. You know, but I think a lot of them changed their minds. They were already kind of, you know, in the opposition to Diaz before the revolution, but they still, you know, worked somehow, you know, in the government, and they didn't take big risks until the opportunity came, you know, with the revolution. So yeah, definitely.
Sandro?
Oh, just a brief comment related to the Canaldo's question. I think that internationally, Zweig, as you presented, has the main idea of this euphemism. But I think, Rinaldo, that there is a connection with what you said about Cuba in your book, the obsession of developmentalism, that it is spread in whole Latin America. So I think that this kind of euphemism during the beginning of since the second half of the 1950s and during the 1960s, it's related to this obsession of developmentalism, and Brasilia plays an interesting role in the conquering of the territory and the constructions of roads and etc. There is something very close to your arguments in your book. So, in my opinion, I don't know if Sam could see the same way, but Zweig plays an important role in terms of spreading this as a country of the future. But there is a national perspective as well, which I think it's similar to what is happening in Latin America. Just brief.
So you want me to comment on the obsession with developmentalism? Yeah, I think that's something that Dos Passos hits home, is that Brasilia is this culmination of all of these ideas of the national future in one place. And it's a project that this ties in with the part about belief and enthusiasm, where I bring in your book, Sandro. It's not just religion that underpins this belief, but it's making Brasilia possible involved the buy-in of people from all over the country. And so I think that gets back a little bit to one of the other questions about is this, it's not just frontiers are out in the hinterland, but this comes in all different directions. So yeah, it's Dos Passos has a long interview in there with Carlos Lacerda, governor of Rio at the time, major figure. And he a couple pages in there where he's talking with Kubitschek. It's not as long as the interview, but that informs all of these ideas. I think that should be it for today, but I thank all of you for your comments and your questions. And again, our emails are in the chat, and we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible the next couple of days, and hopefully at future ASCH and SOLCHA meetings in person. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Congratulations. See you tomorrow.